Let me tell you about the worst day of my life. I was 22 years old, standing in a government gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and collective anxiety, surrounded by 400 people who were about to find out what they were worth. That's what the awakening ceremony was, when you stripped away the flags and the officials with their clipboards and the parents craning their necks from the bleachers. It was a valuation event. The government runs one every year for the new cohort. You step up, you place your hand on the assessment pillar, and the system tells the room what you are. I had waited 3 years for this. I turned 22 in March. The ceremony was in June. For 3 months I had done what everyone does. I had quietly, privately, desperately hoped. Not for S-rank. I wasn't delusional. S-rank hunters were 1 in 10 million. They got recruited the same day, flown to training compounds, handed government stipends and media handlers. I didn't want that. I just wanted something useful. Something that mattered. A combat modifier, a shield class, a healer subtype, anything that would let me step into a dungeon and contribute something real. I stepped up to the pillar. I placed my hand on the crystal surface, which was cold in a way that didn't feel like temperature. It felt like being read. I remember that sensation very clearly. Not coldness. Recognition. The screen above the pillar flickered. Class registered, interpreter. Combat rating, F. Damage output, no. Defense modifier, no. Mana coefficient, no. Field recommendation, not suitable for active duty. Archive division placement, recommended. Someone in the back of the room laughed. Not a snort. A full, open, completely unself-conscious laugh, like they'd seen a punchline coming from a mile away and it had still landed perfectly. I stepped down from the pillar. I walked across the gymnasium floor. Nobody said anything to me. The officials didn't make eye contact. The other inductees shifted slightly as I passed, the way people shift away from something that might be contagious. I pushed open the side door and stepped out into the June heat alone. My phone buzzed before the door had even swung shut behind me. Government Hunter Registry, automated notification, your awakening assessment has been processed. Class, Interpreter, F. You are not recommended for field duty. Please report to Archive Division, Sector 7, Building C, within 14 business days for orientation. Thank you for your service. I read it twice. Then I put the phone in my pocket. Then I looked at my hand, the one that had touched the pillar. The one the system had read. My expression, I'm told, was completely neutral. That part is true. But something behind my eyes had already started moving. Here's what everyone knows about the class system. 10 years ago, June 14th, to be exact, which the newspapers later called the Resonance Day and which the government officially designates as National Awakening Memorial, every human being on Earth between the ages of 14 and 35 woke up with a class. Not a skill. Not a power. A class. A structured, labeled, systematically evaluated cognitive or physical architecture that the system, whatever the system actually is, and I'll come back to that, had decided to assign. The world did not handle this calmly. The first 3 years were chaos. 17 nations declared martial law. 4 governments collapsed entirely when it turned out their entire military apparatus was now composed of individuals who answered to a ranking hierarchy that had nothing to do with chains of command. An A-rank soldier with a Berserker class doesn't take orders from a general who clocked in at C-rank support. That was a problem nobody had anticipated. Wars almost started. A few small ones did. Then the dungeon gates opened. And suddenly the chaos had a direction. The Archive Division is located in a building that was clearly designed by someone who believed that government workers should feel the weight of their own mediocrity. It's a gray slab of a structure on the eastern edge of the Hunter Affairs campus, no windows on the lower 3 floors, fluorescent lighting throughout, carpet the color of a compromise. The Archive Division specifically occupies floors 2 through 4, sandwiched between the motor pool on the ground floor and the record storage facility above, which is accessible only by a freight elevator that smells like old paper and broken ambition. I had been working there for 2 years by the time this story really starts. My job was audio transcription. Specifically, I was assigned to the anomalous vocalization backlog, the government's very clinical way of saying, a pile of recordings nobody can figure out. Every dungeon expedition that involved an audio-equipped team generated recordings. Most were just combat noise. But some contained sounds the standard acoustic analysis software couldn't classify. Patterns that weren't random. Rhythms that repeated. Structures that resembled language without matching any known language database. Nobody thought they were language. The official classification was nonverbal aggressive vocalizations, pattern uncertain. The files sat in a backlog queue that stretched back 9 years. When a normal person listens to monster vocalizations, they hear noise. Aggressive noise, sometimes rhythmic noise, but fundamentally, noise. The audio analysis software agrees with them. It charts the frequencies, identifies the decibel ranges, notes the timing patterns, and produces a graph that says, no linguistic structure detected. When I listened, something different happened. The best analogy I have is this: imagine you've been hearing a song your entire life but you were only ever able to hear the bass line. And then one day, without warning, you can hear all of it, the melody, the harmony, the counterpoint, the lyrics. Nothing has changed about the song. But suddenly it's not noise anymore. It's music. And you realize you've been humming it wrong your whole life. My class didn't translate the sounds. Translation implies 2 discrete languages with a dictionary between them. What the interpreter class actually did, what I only began to understand slowly, over months of sitting alone in that gray building with headphones on, was restructure my cognitive access to communication itself. I didn't hear monster vocalizations and convert them to English. I heard them and understood them the way I understood a sentence in my native language. Immediately, completely, without intermediate steps. The recordings in the backlog were not aggressive vocalizations. They were conversations. Arguments, mostly. Territorial claims. Warnings. Occasionally something that felt like grief. Monsters in dungeons talking to each other, to the walls of the dungeons themselves, to things that weren't present in the recordings but that were clearly being addressed. I had been filing reports about this for 2 years. My supervisor had been not reading them for 2 years. Let me tell you about Director Vance, because if I'm going to be accurate, I have to admit that I noticed him before he noticed me. Or rather, I noticed that he was watching, before I understood why he was watching. Director Elliot Vance ran the Archive Division's Research and Classification Subdirectory, the branch responsible for analyzing all anomalous dungeon phenomena. In practice, architectural anomalies, biological anomalies, and linguistic anomalies. The third category was my department's function, technically, though nobody in the building seemed to think it warranted much urgency. He was 53. Tall, precisely dressed, with the kind of stillness in his movements that comes from spending a long time being very careful about things. His class, C-rank analysis. On the surface, a career bureaucrat's power, useful for interpreting data, writing thorough reports. Not flashy. Not combat applicable. The first time I had seen Vance, 8 months after I started at Archive, he walked through the floor on what was presented as a routine inspection. He spoke to Webb for 4 minutes. Looked at 3 workstations. Nodded at 2 analysts. Left. Standard. Unremarkable. Here is what I noticed, because I noticed things. He did not look at 3 workstations. He looked at 4. The 4th was mine. He spent approximately 2 seconds on each of the other 3. He spent 6 seconds on mine. He looked at my screen, a waveform analysis opened beside a handwritten notepad covered in my transcription notes. He read the notepad. I could tell because his eyes moved left to right in the pattern of someone reading text, not scanning a surface. Then he left. A week later, the red-labeled priority folders started appearing on my desk. Only 2 the first month. Then 4 the next. Always through web, always framed as routine overflow, always with the specific instruction to prioritize them above the backlog queue. 8 months of this. And then, on that Tuesday, after I'd been sitting with the Thornwall audio file for an hour, after I'd listened to it 6 times and written 3 pages of notes and sat with the particular cold feeling you get when you understand something you're not sure you were meant to understand, my phone rang. Internal line. Extension I didn't recognize. RENN, archive, Wren speaking. VANCE, Mr. Wren. I understand you received the Thornwall file this morning. I'd like to discuss your preliminary findings. In person. My office, floor 4, this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Not phrased as a request. But not quite an order either. The tone of someone who expected compliance and was being polite about it as a courtesy. RENN, all right. I put down the phone. I looked at my 3 pages of notes. I thought about the fact that Vance had specifically requested this file be brought to me, and specifically called me himself rather than routing through web, and had done so before I'd sent in any findings. He already knew what was on the recording. I filed that question in a folder in the back of my mind labeled things I don't have enough information to answer yet. It's a big folder. I add things to it constantly. The field assignment came through the next morning, and I want to be very clear about this, it was presented as a clerical error. The assignment notification arrived in my inbox at 7:48. Subject line, Field Assignment, Escort Detail, Thornwall Sector 9 Dungeon, B rank clearance level. My name was on it. My employee ID. My classification, Archive Division, Transcription Specialist, F rank. Below my name, the rest of the team roster, 4 hunters, B rank and above. Party lead, B rank assault class, Jean Chai. 2 B rank fighters. 1 C rank healer. And me. I forwarded it to Web immediately. I believe this was sent in error. Please advise. Webb's reply, assignment confirmed. You've been added as documentation specialist. Carry a recording unit. Don't engage with hostiles. Stay behind the party at all times. Transport at 0800. I stared at this for a long time. Then I got up, signed out a field recorder, and went to find the transport. Jean Chai was a compact, efficient-looking person in her late 20s with the bearing of someone who had been doing this long enough to be very good at it and was annoyed about having to be good at things. She looked at my Archive Division badge, different color from Hunter badges, says non-combat personnel in small print, and then at the transport manifest, and then at me again. And you're Wren. Archive. Yes. Can you run? Necessary. She looked at my shoes, which were office shoes, and something moved across her face that I can only describe as resigned professionalism. She walked toward the transport. I followed. The Thornwall dungeon gate was a standard B-rank aperture, about 4 meters wide, the characteristic blue-gray shimmer, set into a cliff wall fenced off with government barriers. The field coordinator handed Jean a briefing packet. She read it in 45 seconds. Audio specialist. You go in with us. Stay at the rear, minimum 10 meters behind the party. Operate your recording unit. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to engage with anything inside the dungeon. Understood. She looked at me for a moment longer than the instructions required. Then she turned and walked through the gate. I followed. Thornwall was a dungeon that had been partially cleared 9 times over 11 years without ever being fully completed. The reason was the 3rd floor. Floors 1 and 2 were standard B-rank content, stone corridors, territorial beasts, trap mechanisms a competent party could navigate without significant risk. Floor 3 was different. The architecture changed 200 meters in, the stone became older, the construction more deliberate. And on floor 3's central corridor, there was a guardian entity. The entity had been encountered by every expedition that reached it. For meters at the shoulder, bipedal, a body plan that didn't match any catalogued monster type. It stood in the center of the passage, did not attack, and emitted vocalizations no one could classify. I had listened to 12 recordings of this entity's vocalizations in the course of my backlog work. I knew its voice very well. We reached the 3rd floor without incident. The transition point was marked by a change in the stone, rough-cut gray giving way to something darker and smoother, with shallow carvings along the lower walls that every expedition report described as decorative. I looked at them as we passed. They were not decorative. But I stayed behind the party and kept moving, because that wasn't the problem that needed solving right now. The central corridor opened ahead. Jean raised her fist and the party stopped. 20 meters in front of us, the guardian entity stood. Let me describe what I saw, and let me describe it carefully, because the details matter. The entity was everything the report said: large, bipedal, wrong in the specific way that creatures from dungeon ecosystems are wrong, assembled from evolutionary pressures that have nothing to do with the world above the gate. A face that was not quite a face and eyes that were not quite eyes. It stood with a stillness that read as either profound calm or profound age. Possibly both. Its vocalization pattern began the moment we entered the corridor. I will not try to reproduce the sound. I can tell you that it was low, multitonal, with a rhythm that was not random, that it had the cadence of formal speech, of something being recited with careful attention to each component. I stood at the rear of the party and listened. And I understood every word. The nesting corridor is behind the 3rd alcove on the right. The young were placed there 6 days ago. They cannot be moved safely. We ask that you use the eastern passage, which is clear, and leave the nesting corridor undisturbed. We do not wish conflict. We ask only that you do not disturb the young. Jean had her weapon drawn. Haruto was moving into a flanking position. Priya had dropped into a starting stance, weight forward, completely prepared to cover the distance in under 2 seconds. I said, "Wait." 4 people turned and looked at me. This was, I believe, the first time any of them had looked directly at me since we entered the dungeon. I stepped forward, not past them, not to the front of the formation, but far enough that I could see the entity's face clearly, and it could see mine. RENN. It's not attacking. It's asking us to leave the nesting corridor. There are young in the 3rd alcove on the right, placed 6 days ago. It's asking us to use the eastern passage. J-in. You understood that? RENN. Yes. J-in. That's a monster vocalization. RENN. Yes. She looked at the entity. She looked at me. She looked at the entity again. Its posture had changed, still making sound, still speaking, but shifted in the specific way that posture changes when the thing you're speaking to has stopped moving and seems to be listening. Jean. How certain are you? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the 12 recordings I'd processed. The recitation passage on the Thornwall audio file, the formal cadence, the deliberate structure, the way the entity had been reciting something that felt like a standing policy rather than an improvised response. I thought about the carvings on the lower walls that were not decorative. Completely certain, I said. Jean. Eastern passage. Move. The party moved. I turned to follow, and as I did, I looked back at the entity. It had gone quiet. Its posture had changed again, not aggression or retreat, but something else. Something that, in a human, I would have called relief. It looked at me for a moment. Then it stepped aside, clearing the central corridor. Not because we were using it. It would have cleared the corridor regardless. It stepped aside as a gesture. An acknowledgement. As the specific physical grammar of I understand that you understood me. I turned and followed the party into the eastern passage. No one said anything for a very long time.